So here we go. Let's jump into extensions of the Cold War for this year and for next year. The focus is going to be on Vietnam. So let's go have a look at how are we going to get into this, and basically how to write an essay. Please note that the techniques that I speak about here can be used in any essay question. Obviously, the content that I'm using is very specific to Vietnam, but the technique, like how to write an introduction, how to write a line of argument, how to write the conclusion, you can use that for any essay that you are doing. So let's get into it. Boom, I'm writing an essay. All right, so there's a few symbols that you need to know. You'll be familiar with it. Basically, this is how your essay will be marked. There's some good symbols and there's some bad symbols as well. So if we look at our good symbols, we've got analysis. That means you mentioned the point and then you basically analyzed what you said, you gave an example, went into detail about it, and showed evidence of analysis. It's very difficult to get this, and I hardly ever give it to kids. Then you've also got interpretation, where you basically have a point that you have worked out yourself. So it's not necessarily in the textbook or it's not in the resources, but you have shown your own interpretation. For example, they give you a difficult topic and you draw a conclusion that is impossible to draw without using your own kind of understanding. Also very, very difficult to get this interpretation, because what tends to happen is that kids come with basically a set, I'm going to say this and this and this, and then they don't actually adapt what they've written to the question, which would show a little bit of interpretation. So very rare to get analysis, very rare to get interpretation. Then we've got the line of argument, or the LOA. If your teacher is like me, they'll do the arrow that looks like this to show that you have a line of argument. If they are not like me, they'll probably just write LOA. This basically means that your essay has a flow, right? And then your essay should have about 1 tick for every paragraph if it is correctly written. So if your paragraph answers everything that is required of it, a tick. At the end of this essay, you should have about 10 to 14 ticks, depending how many paragraphs you have. Obviously, some people write their essays differently. They like to group things differently. And as such, the essay might have less paragraphs or more paragraphs, depending. Then we've got some bad symbols. So these symbols are when your introduction, main aspects, and conclusion are not properly contextualized. Then you'll see that little, looks like a copy. That just means that you've included information without including the background information, without kind of putting it into context, without relating it to the question. It's just information, but you can't tie it to the question necessarily, or you've left something out. The next thing that you don't want to see in your essay is a line like this. So for example, it tends to happen when you use dates. So I advise you just to stay away from dates as far as possible. Just say in the 1970s, in the 1960s, and avoid the dates. And then you've got that line. So for example, something happens in 1954 and then you write that it happens in 1957, then the teacher will underline it, which means it is wrong. So you don't get to see this obviously in the matric exams, but like just for, I don't know, posterity. Anyway, next we've got these dash lines. It goes down in a line like that. It basically means irrelevant statements. So you're talking about things that they didn't ask for. So for example, if they give you a time period of 1960 to 1970, and now you're talking about things that happened in 1950, or you're talking about things that happened in 1980, that information becomes irrelevant. We don't need it to answer the question. And it actually leads to you losing marks, so be careful of that. Then you must be wary of repetition. It's symbolized by an R. My kids are very guilty of doing this, and it's partially my own fault, because when I taught them how to write a line of argument in grade 10, the easiest way to do it is just to finish every sentence with something that every paragraph with something that links back to the question. So for example, I'm thinking about the essay I gave them in grade 10, which was that King Louis's bad leadership was the only reason for the French Revolution. So obviously, that was an essay about the causes of the French Revolution, and they had to explain how King Louis's bad leadership was only one of the reasons, and there were many other reasons, and we'll go into detail about that. And the line of argument that I kind of taught them just to get them in that vibe of using line of arguments was, therefore, this shows that King Louis's leadership was not the only reason for the French Revolution. And they wrote that after each and every paragraph. So when I was teaching line of arguments, it was fine because it was just kind of getting them used to the concept of a line of argument. But as they went up in years, many of them got very comfortable with doing that, and they ended up just checking, okay, what's the question? Let me write that as a line of argument. But recently, it has become a problem, because now what is happening is they are just repeating themselves over and over and over, and they're not actually showing that analysis or interpretation. So they can actually also be penalized in terms of their presentation for repetition, even if the essay is perfect, because they have been unable to adapt that line of argument to the question that was asked and adapt it so that it's unique, right? So just be careful of that. It's very easy to fall into that trap. Right, so here we go, how to write an introduction. I'm going to use this essay question as a basis, but you could get many other different kinds of questions. This question is just a base, like I said. So explain to what extent Vietnam was successful in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system in the 1960s and the 1970s. Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. So we walk into the exam venue, we see our essay questions, and now we don't know what we need to do. The first thing you need to do is you need to choose which one you're going to be answering, either question 4, question 5, question 6. If I'm not mistaken, this is question 4. And then you will see there, you need to identify your question word, your keyword, your question focus, and your time period. So your question word will either be, do you agree, critically discuss, or to what extent, will be one of those 3. Your keyword will be the main thing that you need to prove. So in this case, you need to prove how Vietnam was successful. Now, I want you just to take note of that. The emphasis of this question is on Vietnam's success. And what a lot of kids tend to do is when this work is taught, it's very much focused on the USA's failure instead of Vietnam's success. So it's very easy to get caught in the trap of saying, instead of saying that Vietnam was successful, you end up arguing that the USA was unsuccessful. So just be careful of that. Here, they don't necessarily want you to focus too much on the USA. They want you to speak about what Vietnam did, right? And to what extent can we say that Vietnam's strategies during the war were successful in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system? So it is a bit of a tricky question, but if you are alert, you pick it up and then you adapt your argument appropriately to that question. Then you'll see that the question focus is focusing on preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system. So you need to say all the ways in which Vietnam was successful in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system. You're not going to speak about all the history of Vietnam, for example, that French war thing. You're going to really just focus on the USA being in Vietnam. Then you're going to see here that our time period is from the 1960s to the 1970s, meaning everything that happens before the 1960s, you leave it out. Anything that happens after the 1970s, you leave it out. So basically your time period is from 1960 to 1979. And that is the period of time you have to work with. You can't necessarily speak about stuff that happened in the 1950s, and you can't speak about stuff that happens in the 1980s. You need to support your line of argument with relevant evidence that you will see in any type of question. So what do you need to do? Firstly, you need to take a stance. So you're going to write, I agree to a great extent or a lesser extent with the statement that the. So you don't say great extent or lesser extent, you choose one. So you either say a great extent or you're going to say lesser extent. Please keep in mind that this particular question is a bit tricky. You might be tempted to say Vietnam was successful to a great extent in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system. But you also need to keep in mind that if you're going to do that, you need to argue from Vietnam's side. If you're going to say to a lesser extent, then you're going to say argue from the USA side. So be careful not to get caught in that trap. You can do it either way, but just be careful in how you set that question up. Then there's also the thing that we're trying to kind of get the I out of you guys because we want you to write in an academic way. Personally, I don't mind, but some people are very strict with that, that you have to write in third person. But I think in a question where they specifically ask you, like, do you agree? It's okay to say, I agree. But if you really want to keep that third person formal academic writing, you can change the I to one. So you can say, one can agree to a greater extent or lesser extent, you just choose one, with the statement that the Vietnam was successful in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system. Then you need to give a reason why you agree or disagree, or you say to a great extent or less extent. So if you agree to a great extent, you would say because Vietnam did this and this and this, and as a result, the USA was unable to impose a capitalist system. Just one sentence, more or less. And you can start it like this. The reason for this is because. And then you finish off by saying, summarizing what information will be in the essay. So this is how to write a top class introduction. It's not necessary for everyone, but if you're aiming for that 50 out of 50, you need to follow these 3 steps. If you are somebody that struggles, it might help you just to do the first 2 steps, right? Where you just say you agree and this is the reason why you agree. It might also help you if you're struggling to do the first step and the second step and leave out the first step and the third step and leave out the second step, because it can still be a really good introduction just with a stance and saying what's going to be in the essay. But if you want that full marks, you need to show this reasoning, because this shows your analysis, it shows your interpretation, it shows that you know what you're talking about. So don't forget that second step. But what happens if you get a different type of question? So other types of questions could be the tactics and strategies that the United States of America used against North Vietnam failed during the Cold War conflict between 1965 and 1973. Critically discuss the statement, use relevant evidence to support your argument. So I want you to take note about how the focus of the question has changed. So now, instead of focusing on Vietnam's success, we're focusing on the United States of America's failure. Right, so it's weird that it is actually a different type of question. It's saying the same thing, but in reverse. And then you'll notice also that your time period is from 1965 to 1973. So now it's very specific. The previous one was very broad, gave you basically any time from 1960 to 1979. Here, your essay needs to start in 1965 and it needs to end in 1973. So let's have a look at what needs to happen here. In the case where you get a critically discussed question, you are going to repeat the question focus as an answer. Example, you need to indicate whether the USA failed or not with their tactics and their strategies. So there's no clear stance like, I agree that, blah, blah, blah. You just started by saying the USA's strategies and tactics that they used against North Vietnam failed, right? Or you would say they were successful, depending. Candidates should give reason why they say the USA failed. So if you say the USA failed, you need to give reasons for that. If you say they were successful, you need to give reasons for that. Candidates should outline what will be present in the essay. So once again, we use that question word in our introduction. We're going to say the essay will critically discuss this, 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 and this. So because the focus of this is on the tactics and the strategies, what might be useful to do in that case is just list out all of your tactics and strategies. Right, so let's move on. Then for the last type of question, we have a do you agree question. So from 1964 to 1972, here it's changed a bit as well. So now we're focusing on the time period from 1964 to 1972. The wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world. So what are they talking about here when they speak about this? They're speaking about the USA. Okay, made a maximum military effort, everything short of atomic bombs, to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny peasant country and failed. Right? So do you agree? So then you would say, you would take a stance, you'd say, yes, I agree with the statement, or no, I disagree with the statement, and then you just repeat the statement. You can play around with the language a little bit to keep it a bit shorter. You don't need to use the whole statement. You can just use the most important parts. I disagree that the wealthiest nation failed, or I agree that the wealthiest nation failed, even despite the fact that they use a maximum military effort. Candidates must provide justification for their stance. So once again, give reasons why you say that, and then you must support your stance with evidence. Alrighty, so let's move along. So this is basically an outline of what needs to be in this essay. It's quite a long essay, especially if you do things in the proper amount of detail. So this was taken from a past papers memo, and it's based on that first question that we had discussed: to what extent the Vietnam was successful in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system in the 1960s and 1970s. Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. So your synopsis, what needs to be in this essay, is you should focus on the conflict between Vietnam and the USA. So you're not really focusing on what's happening outside of the conflict, like the media or things like that. You are really just focusing with zooming in on that conflict as an attempt to withstand the USA's imposition of capitalism. So every time you speak about something that happens in the conflict, you need to speak about how that shows that Vietnamese are trying to withstand the USA coming in there and trying to take over, and the rejection thereof by the Vietnamese people between 1960s and 1970s. So with that, you might, for example, let's say, I'm going to use the hearts and minds one because that's the easiest, but basically the fact that the Americans were trying to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people by doing all of these things. And then what ended up happening is that the Vietnamese people just rejected it. And it wasn't really a win for capitalism because they didn't agree with things that the USA was doing. So you always need to frame your things in that kind of way, because you're tying it back to this question that Vietnam is preventing the USA from imposing the capitalist system. Now, this is slightly different than a different kind of essay where they would ask you, why was the USA a failure? So then you'd have to look at all the different things. And instead of saying the Vietnamese were rejecting, the Vietnamese were fighting back, the Vietnamese were doing this, now your argument would change to the USA had failed in doing this, the USA had failed in doing that, right? So let's have a look at our main aspects. Firstly, in our introduction, we should focus on the involvement of the US in Vietnam and the rejection of it by the Vietnamese people. And you must basically just outline your argument so you can use that strategy that I taught you like 5 minutes ago. And then with your elaboration, you're going to mention the following points. You're going to mention after the French-Vietnamese War, Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam. North Vietnam being communist, South Vietnam being capitalist. And as we know, this was not a unique story, happened in many different countries all over the world. South Vietnam was ruled by the corrupt and unpopular. Now, please, I apologize because I'm not very good at the names. I literally just watched the video on this earlier today just to get the pronunciation and I've forgotten. I think it was Dinh Diem. He was basically a ruthless dictator and the Vietnamese people just didn't like him at all. And that because of his corruption and his kind of taking over the elections, doing basically illegal things, the National Liberation Front was formed and they had a guerrilla army, which they called the Viet Cong. And this was in direct response to Diem having illegal elections and things like that. So No Dinh Diem was overthrown, which led to instability in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong realized that this is the chance that they have in order to unify Vietnam. So remember, it's divided into North and South. They just want to have one country called Vietnam. And obviously, they want this one country to be under communism. China and North Vietnam supported the Viet Cong. So the Viet Cong is like that guerrilla kind of soldiers. It's basically just peasant farmers, really. And they have this idea that communism is what they want Vietnam to have. They've seen it work in North Vietnam, they've seen it work in China, and they would like it to work in South Vietnam as well, unify the country. Obviously, we've previously, if you go back to the previous video, I'll link it above or I'll link it at the end of the video. But in the previous video, we discussed the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, which basically said that, specifically the Truman Doctrine, that the USA would support any country that was threatened by communism. So when Mr. Dictator No Diem is being overthrown, the USA is like, we can't let this happen because that means Vietnam is going to become communist. So if Vietnam becomes communist, what's going to happen to the rest of Southeast Asia? We've already got China communist, Korea's communist. What's going to happen to all these other countries? So they start this idea of the domino effect again. That needs to be present in your essay. You need to explain what the domino effect was and why. This is one of the main reasons why the USA gets involved in the war, even though it's happening on the other side of the world. Well, I suppose it's not that far. I mean, the world is round. But yeah, if we look at a flat map, they're on the other side of the world. So the Viet Cong received supplies from the communist North Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So just so you know, Ho Chi Minh was the leader of North Vietnam. He was also sort of a dictator as well. So it's like bit of the devil you know, the devil you don't. I don't know. And that is how the Viet Cong were able to basically resist America. So when you do this essay, you are going to discuss the USA's offensive and basically how the Vietnamese people responded to each of these different offensives. So how did they respond to Operation Rolling Thunder? So the Tet Offensive was something that they did. So you need to say, why was the Tet Offensive successful in preventing the USA from imposing capitalism? You have the USA's use of chemical warfare, such as napalm and Agent Orange, which was very, very unpopular. And then we have the winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people and the use of the media in the Vietnam War. We've got the USA's public opposition to the war back home. People are protesting and things like that. You've got the USA's heavy losses to the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And then eventually you have the USA withdrawing from the Vietnam War. You end off the essay by speaking about how Saigon falls. And please note that the fall of Saigon is not the conclusion. It is just the last paragraph before your conclusion. The reason I say this is because a lot of people feel, okay, this shows that the war is over now, so I'm going to end it there. But you remember that the conclusion isn't just telling a story. It's tying up. You can think of it like a closing argument of a lawyer. You need to actually prove what you've said in your introduction. No new information can be introduced in the conclusion. So you need to make sure, even if you end that the USA withdraws from Vietnam, Saigon falls and becomes part of the now communist Vietnam nation. And this, then you will then tie it to the introduction and end off your argument. So just be careful of doing that. A lot of people think when they get towards the end, okay, I'm done now. But tying up your argument and writing the last thing is two different things. Right, so these are the USA strategies. Are you able to identify them? I'll give you 2 seconds. All right, let's see how many of them we got right. First up, we have sending in helicopters and military advisors. So before the USA actually physically got involved in the war, they sent in helicopters, they sent in military advisors to South Vietnam to help them fight the Viet Cong. Then we've got Operation Ranch Hand and Agent Orange, where they basically went over the thick jungle foliage and they had this chemical warfare to destroy all the forestation and vegetation, and it actually had a terrible, terrible effect on the land. It ended up making the land sterile and things like that, and then it also affected the people. Many people being born with birth defects, many people being born, people that were alive actually getting health issues because of the use of Agent Orange. And then you've got the strategic hamlet, where they basically tried to move these villages and things like that, which ended up getting them hated by the Vietnamese people because you're moving people forcibly from their ancestral lands and things like that. And then you've got the winning the hearts and minds, where they would go and build what's like access to water and those sorts of things, electricity and things, and it didn't really work. So they tried to do these things to kind of show people, look how cool capitalism is, look at all the things we can do for you, but it was rejected by the Vietnamese people. Then we had Operation Flaming Dart. That was basically after President Eisenhower, I think, passes away. No, it's not President Eisenhower, it's President Kennedy. So President Kennedy passes away, and then he's taken, President Lyndon Johnson takes over, and President Kennedy was kind of sort of already pulling out of Vietnam. He was saying, okay, this is a waste of my time. Let's get everyone out of Vietnam. But when President Johnson comes in, he's like, stop, hold the phone. We are going to go back into the Vietnam War, and we're going to put all of our focus on it. But they needed an excuse to do that, so they organized Operation Flaming Dart, where they basically pretended, well, I'm not sure if they pretended or if it actually happened, that the Viet Cong had attacked an American person, and then they used that as an excuse to go full scale into the war. And then we have Operation Rolling Thunder, which was just a period of continuous bombing of roads, bombing of railways, bombing of critical infrastructure, the hope of pressurizing the Vietnamese people to do what America wanted. It was a failure because the Viet Cong carried on with what they were doing, even though the actual country was kind of being constantly and consistently bombed. Then we have the very controversial My Lai massacre, where the USA basically targeted innocent civilians. I think something like 300 innocent civilians were killed, and this looked very, very bad on the USA because they tried to cover it up. They did it, and then they pretended like it didn't happen, but they were caught. And it was devastating to the USA's side. It made them look like monsters. And then we also have the role of the media. You know, in the 1960s, we've got all this new technology coming out, one of it being television. And in the past, like in the 40s and in the 30s, your main form of news was through the radio or it was through newspapers. And those things were sort of heavily manipulated by the government, propaganda, so to speak. But now, with the advent of TVs and things like that, people could actually see what was happening sort of in real time. So no matter what the government said about the Vietnam War, people could see, oh my word, look what's actually happening. People are being killed here. And it was the first time that the ordinary person like you and me had access to see what happens in a war zone. Before that, you just got news back from the front. Someone would write you a letter, or you'd read something in the newspaper, or someone would say something on the radio. But when you see it for yourself, that's something completely different. So it led to a lot of people wanting to protest against the Vietnam War, and a lot of American people actually fighting back against their own government, asking for the government to pull out of Vietnam. So yeah, I call this USA strategies, but I suppose I should probably write it's tactics and strategies, and also some of it is just stuff that happens. All right, so let's move along. So how to write the body of the essay? Firstly, you need to have an introduction. Quite a few learners, particularly at schools where maybe they don't have as many equipment and things like that, they just come in and they write an essay. They don't write an introduction. They just start writing and they finish writing. They don't write a conclusion, and they end up losing marks for presentation. So make sure that when you are there, you are going to write, start, look at the question, write an introduction that speaks to the question. Then you have a series of paragraphs. You should have about 10-ish, depending on how you structure it. So this one that I'm doing only has about 4 or 5, but it's very, very long paragraphs. You can also split those 5 paragraphs into shorter paragraphs, but then you'd have more of them there. You also have a conclusion where you basically summarize everything you speak about in the essay. So how do you organize each paragraph? So you've seen I've spoken about the PEEL method before, always gets a laugh out of the kids if we speak about the PEEL. You can also use a SEAL, which is statement, explain, example, link. And you can also use SEXY, which also gets a laugh out of the kid, which is statement, explanation, example, and interpretation. But let's use PEEL because most people know that one. So you start with a point, which is just one sentence that tells the examiner what that statement is going to be about, or what that paragraph is going to be about. Then you explain. So for example, if you've got a paragraph on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, you'll start by saying the Ho Chi Minh Trail was established in blah, 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 and this is what they did. So that's your explanation. So you're explaining your point. And then you have your evidence. So what kind of supplies were being taken through the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Who was supplying these things? Why were they supplying it? Give that kind of evidence. And then you finish off with your link, where you either link back to the essay question or you can forward to the next paragraph. So if you link back to the essay question, you will say, this is how the Vietnamese were successful in resisting America, blah, 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 blah. And if you wanted link to the next paragraph, you would say the success of the Ho Chi Minh Trail allowed them to embark on or basically force the USA to step up the what would I say, these strategies or tactics against the Vietnamese. And then in my next paragraph that follows, I'd be speaking about their tactics and the strategies. So you can choose which one you want to do there. I'm going to show you how to do it in a minute. Oh, crap. I forgot I did this. Sorry. Oh, no, it's supposed to... Why is it not working? Oh, well, it's supposed to do clap, clickety, 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 but it didn't. I don't know what I did wrong, but it's okay. Okay, so Ho Chi Minh became Prime Minister of Communist North Vietnam in September 1945, but the USA did not recognize Vietnam as an independent country. So here we go. This is our point. It also serves as a little bit of background. Both Communist China and the USSR recognized Vietnam and supplied it with weapons, technical and diplomatic support. In April 1954, USA President Dwight Eisenhower publicly referred to the spread of communism in South Asia via the domino theory. It meant if one country became communist, its neighbors would follow suit. So that is explaining why the USA basically comes involved. Once again, more and more background. Vietnam was divided into two sections: North Vietnam, controlled by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, controlled by Ngo Diem. After Diem basically rigged the 1955 elections, conflict started with the communists in South Vietnam, called the National Liberation Front, which was also known as the Viet Cong. Diem of South Vietnam was a dictator and he oppressed the people. So the Americans feared that if they did democratic elections, all that would happen is everyone would just vote for the Viet Cong. So America didn't want that to happen, and that's why they wanted to get involved. So the USA wanted to stop or contain the spread of communism. So that's my examples. And they sent financial support, military advisors to help contain that spread of communism. The Americans became involved, and what followed was a period of violence and terror commonly known as the Vietnam War. So how to build a line of argument. So this is a very common question. This is for my people that are aiming to get 35 and higher for their essay. When you write a history essay, you are making an argument either for or against the statement. So in this case, we're saying to a greater extent or to a lesser extent, how were the Vietnamese successful? As such, the whole point is to prove your stance. You do this by making a line of argument. It basically means your entire essay needs to speak to each other and it needs to convince the person reading it of a certain point. So there are three different ways to build a line of argument. The first one is in text. That means while you are busy writing, you are constantly referring back to those key words and phrases from the question. So for example, you could write, the USA wants to prevent communism spreading in Vietnam and impose a capitalist system. So I've put that impose a capitalist system in very, very particularly because I want to draw the examiner's attention to the fact that, look here, I'm using words from the question in the paragraph. I am proving the question in this paragraph. I feel like the more I talk, the more I cough. This is so weird. And I didn't learn my lesson from the previous time when we drink some water. Whatever. So they got involved by sending troops to Vietnam. This led to stage 1 of the war. So what have I done? I've written a paragraph, and within this paragraph, particularly maybe this paragraph is speaking about stage 1 of the war, I've spoken about imposing a capitalist system. The next way to do a line of argument is to link to the next paragraph. You can show how information in one paragraph relates to another. So you can show the cause and effect. This happened, so then following that happened. You can use linking words in the previous paragraph to tie it to the next paragraph. So for example, words like therefore, following this, furthermore, as a result, and then you just kind of write a sentence afterwards following that. So you'd say, therefore, by the end of February 1965, the Vietnam War went into the second stage. So we know that the paragraph that's following is going to be talking about the second stage of the war. Then we go link back to the question. You can prove how the information in the paragraph relates back to the question by using keywords and phrases from the question at the end of your paragraph. So this is the easy way that I was speaking about at the beginning, where you just basically repeat the same thing over and over and over. Now, if you want to avoid getting that repetition thing, you can play around the way that you write this. But basically it goes as follows. This shows how the Vietnamese were successful in preventing the USA from imposing capitalism in their country. You can play around with the way the language is structured. So you can say, therefore, the Vietnamese were able to prevent the USA from forcing capitalism on them. Or you can say, this was one of the ways that the Vietnamese prevented the USA from putting a capitalist system in place. So every time you're writing the same thing, but you're changing your language around, you're being very particular with it. So this is something where you can very easily get caught, because now you're going to write this after each paragraph because it's so nice and easy. And then the examiner marks R for repetition, and then you lose your mark for presentation. So do be careful with that. Play around with your language to make it varied and different. Right, so this is an example of a paragraph. So you'll see that in this paragraph, I mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different strategies. Now, what some teachers do is that they give each strategy its own paragraph, but the problem with that is, while you do go into a little bit more depth and a bit more detail, it ends up making the essay very, very long. So what I've done is I've basically taken these 7 or so strategies and I put them in one paragraph with saying what the strategy is and then explaining this is what we do when we speak about the strategy, and then saying what was the result of the strategy. So if you see something that is black, something that is purple, that is a line of argument. I'm using the in-text method. And then the next one, if you see the black or the bold or the big dot, that is one of the main points. So let's just read through this example paragraph to see how we would structure this. The Viet Cong had been fighting a guerrilla war against the South Vietnamese government of Diem. They were joined in 1957 by North Vietnamese soldiers. The People's Army of Vietnam helped the Viet Cong. They secretly entered into local communities and used bombs to destabilize Diem's government. The People's Army also constructed the Ho Chi Minh Trail to supply the Viet Cong with weapons from North Vietnam. When John F. Kennedy became US president, he sent military advisors and a squadron of Huey helicopters to help the South Vietnam government against the Viet Cong. In January 1962, the Americans began Operation Ranch Hand, spraying the chemical Agent Orange over forests in South Vietnam to expose the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This had a devastating effect on the vegetation and on the people, causing many Vietnamese to develop health issues, and children were born with birth defects. This operation was a failure as it did not stop the Viet Cong. So do you see how I've spoken about the different strategies used? And then I've spoken about how the Vietnamese themselves have also fought back. And then I spoke about whether the USA was successful or not. In this case, I said it was a failure. You can rephrase that so that you can say the Vietnamese successfully resisted these operations or these tactics. And then you relate it better to that, to a greater extent, to a lesser extent argument. In 1962, the USA used the unpopular Strategic Hamlet program to separate the peasants from communist forces, and it failed miserably because they separated people from their villages and their ancestral land. In 1962, the South Vietnamese and the US advisors established the Hearts and Minds programs, which brought water, education, healthcare to the peasants, and this was aimed at making the peasants see the benefits of capitalism. However, it did not make a big impact. So the peasants once again resisted this, which shows that they were successful in preventing the USA from imposing a capitalist system. China and the USSR were supplying North Vietnam and the Viet Cong with planes, boats, and guns. So you have to see the Americans need to step up their game. They start sending in troops. So this already shows that the Vietnamese are putting immense pressure on them, because in the past they would just send advice or they'd use outside forces, but now they're actually physically kind of getting involved. The Battle of Ap Bac was an encouraging victory for the Viet Cong against the US. So remember, the question is trying to prove that the Vietnamese successfully prevented the USA, and here we can see they are winning. The USA wants to get rid of Diem as leader of South Vietnam, especially after protest was published in the US media of Buddhist priests burning themselves in public. President Kennedy therefore gave his approval that would get rid of Diem, and he and his family were executed on the 2nd of November 1963. By September 1963, Kennedy wanted to withdraw, but still sent military advisors to Vietnam. After Kennedy's death, the new US President Lyndon Johnson used military power to enforce foreign policy, reversed Kennedy's disengagement policy, and made winning the Vietnam War a top priority. Johnson and his advisors manipulated the Gulf of Tonkin incident on the 2nd of August 1964, in which the Vietnamese allegedly attacked an American. Okay, sorry, I confused earlier with the Operation Flaming Dart. I was actually thinking of the Gulf of Tonkin. So Flaming Dart is something different. Sorry. See, even I make mistakes. In response to the Viet Cong attack, the USA undertook Operation Flaming Dart to bomb a Viet Cong base in North Vietnam. But the response to that is that the USSR just supplies North Vietnam with military equipment and military advisors. And by the end of February 1965, the Vietnam War went into its second stage. So once again, that's that line of argument, kind of leading you into the second stage of the war. You can also play around with that to show that the Vietnamese were therefore able to resist America to such an extent that America couldn't finish this war as quickly as they thought they could. And by this point, it's already going on for a couple of years, and they are still like right in the thick of it. It's not looking like it's going to end anytime soon. So you'll see, because I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 bullets here. I've given myself a tick, and I've made a little line of argument symbol to show that I have a line of argument, and this paragraph has been fully explained. So what I would like you guys to do now is, you can see that the main points of the second stage of the Vietnam War have been shown over here. You should use them to construct the paragraph using the PEEL method. So you need to mention that stage 2 of the war started on the 2nd of March 1965. And it started with Operation Rolling Thunder, which was aimed at disabling the North and South Vietnamese infrastructure, such as roads, tunnels, bridges, and bases. We need to mention that it lasted for 3 years, but even though it lasted so long, it did not get the Vietnamese to surrender. Therefore, the tactic was a failure. Then you can speak about the propaganda in the US media. You can say that initially the American public opinion supported the deployment of troops in Vietnam. However, you had pockets of people that were protesting against it, and many young men publicly burnt their draft cards, absolutely refused to go and serve in Vietnam. Then you had guerrilla warfare. Later in 1965, we had 200,000 US troops deployed to Vietnam on ground battles. So remember, before we had aeroplanes and things like that with the Agent Orange and the Rolling Thunder. Now we've got people on the ground, but they were not trained for guerrilla warfare in the bush and in the jungle. So when they got into the jungle, they didn't know how to fight. And as a result, with the Battle of La Drang, we had General Westmoreland from the USA using search and destroy operation in the Vietnam jungle. Then you have a Tet Offensive, which is one of the major victories for the Viet Cong, where they struck 100 cities, and it lasted from January 1968 till September 1968. American forces were unable to handle this because they were on stand down mode. They weren't ready for it. They couldn't respond quickly enough. So it was considered a victory for the Viet Cong. Then we had the My Lai massacre, which is where the Americans tried to cover up the notorious My Lai massacre, in which their troops murdered over 300 Vietnamese civilians. Remember, these are non-combatants. These are people that don't fight back, and they've been massacred. So the media gets hold of this, and even though people were initially very supportive of Johnson's policies, now they become very critical. They say, we don't want to be part of the Vietnam War. The war is far from over. We're losing. It's time to pull us out, right? So then we have the USA kind of entering into peace talks because of this increasing pressure. However, the Vietnamese armies continued to negotiate while fighting, and neither side was prepared to compromise. Progress was slow. China and North Korea, however, withdrew in 1968. And by 1969, when Johnson finished his time as president, there was no resolution. So they were in peace talks, but they weren't able to get to a resolution, which means it's still going to continue into the 1970s. So now we get stage 3. Stage 3 starts in 1969 with President Richard Nixon. He promised during his election campaigns he would end the Vietnam War, and to his credit, he does try. He's just very, very slow in how he does it, and that actually has a very negative effect. So he's got the Vietnamization policy, where he starts withdrawing the US troops and giving financial support to strengthen the Vietnamese army. So even though he's taking the US troops out, he's still supporting the South Vietnamese, still trying to be that sort of bulwark against communism. Then back home, you've got these massive anti-war protests, and many people, especially at university, were outraged about what was happening in Vietnam. Nevertheless, because of public pressure, continually the USA is reducing its forces every year from 1971 to 1972, with the last troops being withdrawn in August 1972. Then we've got Operation Linebacker, where we've got the Americans trying to bomb cities in Vietnam, such as Hanoi, to force the North Vietnamese to agree with the American peace proposal. They also promised financial and military aid to get South Vietnam to agree to the peace terms. So the whole point of Operation Linebacker is for people to be forced to do America's will. Both sides claim victory here because the USA claims they forced the North Vietnamese to come to the negotiating table, while the Vietnamese claim that they actually won in the end, because even though they went to the negotiating table, they got what they wanted. Then we had the Paris Peace Accords on the 27th of January 1973, where we had the USA's involvement in the Vietnam War being officially ended. So what you noticed in one of the previous questions, we ended they asked you to stop talking by 1972. And then in one of the other questions, they asked you to stop talking by 1973. So depending on what kind of question you have, you'd either stop your essay here or you'd stop it here. And this one, because it says 1970s, we can stop it right at the end in 1975, where North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam in 1975. The two parts of Vietnam officially become reunited, and President Ton Duc Phang becomes president. And obviously this is under a communist regime. So there we go. That's everything you need to know. What you need to try and do now is take this information that I've given you and make it into 2 different paragraphs. So you can also include another paragraph if you want that basically outlines the perspectives of the war. So initially the Americans supported containing communism using the US troops, but this changed when they weren't winning and many men died far from home. Johnson misled the people that the USA could win the Vietnam War, but the US media actually showed the losses as well as the suffering of the Vietnamese people. Public opinion turned against the war, and President Johnson's popularity declined as large protest rallies by Vietnam veterans and university students in Washington kind of increased. Other perspectives was that while the USA was fighting to contain communism, the Vietnamese were fighting for their independence. We want the independence to do what we want to do in our own country, and the USA doesn't have the right to tell us what to do in our own country. So the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were fighting for national independence against a different imperial power, the USA. So you know, everyone always says colonialism is bad, imperialism is bad, but America was now basically doing the same thing. They were trying to take over another country and force them to do their will. And this is how the Viet Cong saw the war. The world as well also saw the USA as a bully, and this was very bad for the USA's image. So, question, did the USA manage to stop communism from spreading in Vietnam? Short answer, no. Right, so how to write a conclusion. As you write your conclusion and end your essay, you'll want to start by restating the question. The question is the main idea, so it's beneficial to remind the examiner of the purpose of the essay. So you'd say, therefore, this essay has proven blah, 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 blah. The next step is to repeat your supporting points. So you'd say the Vietnamese did this and this and this and this, and this is how they managed to resist. And then lastly, your conclusion should have a sense of closure. There should be no new information introduced in the conclusion. So here's two examples. One, if you had answered to a great extent, and one if you had answered to a lesser extent. So it says, due to all this, it becomes clear to see that the Vietnamese were successful to a great extent in preventing the USA from forcing them to adopt a capitalist system in the 1960s and 70s. This is because almost all of the USA strategies against the Viet Cong were a dismal failure and were unable to stop the Viet Cong advance or win the hearts of the Vietnamese people. The fact that the Vietnam War ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the reunification of Vietnam under a communist regime therefore proves the success of Vietnam against the USA. If you had said to a lesser extent, the argument would look as follows. While the USA were not successful in imposing capitalism on Vietnam, it could be argued that the Vietnamese themselves did not really play a role in preventing this, as many of the USA failures were due to their own incompetence rather than the strength of the Vietnamese strategies. For example, the USA did not train their soldiers for guerrilla warfare and harmed and killed innocent people during the My Lai massacre, which led to massive protests back home. As a result, the Vietnam was successful to a lesser extent in preventing the USA from imposing capitalism, as the USA did not withdraw due to the success of the Viet Cong, but rather due to the increasing pressure from their own country. So there we go, there we have it. That is the Vietnam War in a nutshell. Just based on my own research and based on information that I found. Obviously, if I am incorrect, you are 100% on board. You can just mention in the comments what I said wrong. I'll delete this whole thing and make it over. Because my actual expertise is in the Black Power movement and the civil rights movement. But I thought, since I'm doing Cold War, let me do the Vietnam essay as well. All right, so keep well and good luck for the exams.